Okay, and also if you look at the trend over time, I mean the share of the developing Asia in particular, and also the in terms of the contribution to CO2 emissions. I mean it shows you that the the share of the developing world is actually growing over time. And so if we want to really curb the emission, there's really some work that can be done amongst developing countries. And so that's why I think it's really important to look at ways or policies in which we could influence emissions in these areas. Right. And so, what I mean, this is I presented this in Waseda, and so there's the reason why there's a Japanese worker in here, and then this is the Mount Fuji. But this is just a very easy way of looking at the consequences of stricter energy and environmental policy. And so you have a sort of it's not really a zero sum game, but what we're seeing here is that perhaps if you have stricter energy policy, then you would have this nice view of nice air quality and better way of living. But at some point, I mean, a lot of policymakers are worried about it because it might have some consequences on their manpower or their employment. And so what do we know so far, um, based on the literature? I think, sorry, there should be somewhere in here. Oh, it's hidden. Sorry about that. Okay, there should be a study by Dekenes looking at the pros and cons of stricter energy policy. And so on the pro in that you have good air quality, it has good health benefits. But at the cons of that, there's studies that shows that it put a lot of unintended costs on the companies for the compliance costs, and then it has repercussions on the employment. So there may be some reduction in the wage or substitution from labor to capital. In this case, you may have a bias technological growth against labor. That might be another issue, and that's actually what we're trying to do in another project, and also in terms of employment. And we want to know how these things come about. What are the mechanisms behind it? But what do we know so far? And so the literature on environment labor trade-off has mixed results. I mean, these are the studies that were previously published. One example of this is the studies by Ralph Martin et al. In 2014 at the Journal of Public Economics, looking at the CCL policy in the UK. And then what their studies show is that there's no or very minimal effect on employment associated with stricter energy policy. Now, of course, there are also studies that say there are significant effect on employment. The famous of which would be the study of Michael Greenstone's published at the JPE. And then what they say is that the 1977 Clean Air Act amendment, looking at the county level non-attainment, they have found that it resulted to more than 600,000 jobs over the 15 years. But you have to take it with a grain of salt, because if you look at the environmental benefits of it, I mean it's actually a lot higher than the 600,000 jobs here for over 15 years. But the main argument about this is that you have mixed results, and so it's a very controversial topic up to now. That's why I think it's really important to look at this topic in particular. Now, what we're going to do in this paper is that we want to examine the causal impact of increased energy prices on plant level economic and environmental performance. So that's a lot of things to take in, but we want to focus or zero in our analysis on the fossil fuel subsidy reforms, which happened around 2000 in Indonesia. And we're using the micro data on all small and large enterprises. So arguably, this is a census data. And so because if this is census data, then we would not only look at the surviving firms over time, but we could also actually also look at the firm entry and exit dynamics through that data. And so that makes our analysis a little bit richer. And one contribution of this would be we're focusing on an emerging economic context and a large emitter of greenhouse gas emission, which in the literature, there's a very few studies. One thing that I can think of is the study by World Bank Indonesia by Massimiliano Kali and Presidente, using also Indonesian data, but they a little bit focus on a different topic. So there's really very few studies looking at this particular field. And so why Indonesia? Again, this is very interesting. Why? Because we want to look at we want to tease out the temporal as well as the spatial um, variations in the energy price associated with changes in policies, as well as because it's associated with the specific geography of the area. And so what you see in here on the screen is the timeline of gasoline and diesel subsidy costs, world oil price, and the subsidy reforms in Indonesia. And so the orange line is the world oil price, so it's increasing. And but what's more interesting here is that if you look at the gasoline and diesel subsidy over time as a percentage of GDP, that's represented by the blue line. So the subsidy over time has been declining. And so we want to look at what will be the impact of this on energy price. And so over time, this is what we see from our data. This is just a simple average of all the energy price that we get from the data. We're just focusing on the top energy sources. And so we have here the trend of electricity, fuel, and total energy over time. And these are the specific events that you see. There's a raising of gasoline and diesel price in around 2000, increasing prices for industrial users, and then basing tariff and removing subsidies around 2015. So what's interesting here is that over time, before 2000, the average price that we observe is relatively flat, but there's an upward trend right around 2000, right around the year 2000 when the subsidy reform started to occur. Now, what's interesting here is that the level of change, as you can see here, is that it's not a minuscule or an insignificant change, but it's changing from 100 to 200 up to 300 in terms of IDR for British thermal units. So in essence, if you convert this into price per energy input, the increase is actually quite significant. It's more than twice as much over time. And so we want to tease that out, and we could argue that that could be exogenous, but that might be arguable, and that's the reason why we want to tease that out in the empirical strategy. Okay, again, why Indonesia? Um, there's a study by June Rentschler, Martin Carnegie in 2017 at Energy Economics, and they argue that the changes in the price are quite exogenous. And why? Because this is associated with the logistical differences and infrastructure gaps in Indonesia, and this is because of the geography that's specific to the country, and so they're mainly archipelagic, and so the idea is if a certain place is far from the source, and this is basically consists of many islands, and so their shipping costs, the infrastructures are not that good, and so the further away from the source, the higher the energy price that you would get. Okay, and then you would argue that they are regulated. Yes, but for them to encourage supply in some local areas, they allow private sectors to come in, and that bumps up the local price in that area. And so based on that, you can tease out the arguably exogenous variations in the price associated with the geography. And so this geographic or spatial temporal variations is what we're going to use as our identification strategy in looking at the impact of changes in the price on certain firm level economic and environmental performance. Yeah, just to reaffirm, this is the growth in 2015 energy prices relative to 1988. You see there's electricity and then there's fuel, and so you can see there's lots of variations over space, ranging from 50% all the way to more than 150% in both electricity and fuel.
I,
Right. So
Arlan, sorry, can I just ask you one question here?
sure.
So on this, so you've been arguing somehow about the exogeneity of differences in price levels. Would you say that these also apply in the exogeneity of changes in prices. I understand that, distance and all infrastructure matters for, but then whether one province decide to one district decide to increase or decrease, that might not necessarily reflect this exogenous structure. It might be an endogenous choice.
Right. Yeah, I totally understand that, and that's a good question. That's the reason why we're not only relying on the geographic variation, but we're also going to rely on the temporal variation. Why? Because again, based on what you've seen here, there's temporal variation or changes over time, mainly because in different time period there has been a number of changes in the policy associated with subsidies that the firms are receiving. And so we're going to use that as well. And furthermore, we're going to use an instrument in order to sort of extract the exogenous variation in the spatial temporal changes in the price. And I think this is going to be clearer when I talk about the empirical strategy. Will that be okay?
Sorry, thank you.
Okay.
I raised my hand instead of my.
Oh, sorry. I just see
Sorry,
my
wrong, but it's okay. Thank you.
I just see my the problem is I just see my slide. I don't
Yeah,
see
yeah.
the I
My
don't see you
mistake.
guys.
Sorry.
So
Yeah,
just let me know.
yeah.
Uh,
No problem. Thank you.
I think we have another hand up from Stephen.
okay. Yes, Stephen.
Yeah, just so you had this story about this geographic variation depending upon the source, but when I look at these maps, sort of it seems quite arbitrary, actually, or that it might depend on a lot of other things. It's somewhat related, I guess, to Stefania's question, but could you indicate something about where these large sources were? I mean, is it sort of are they all sort of on the kind of Sumatra area? I'm not really sure. Sort of, I can't see in this map that story that you sort of told us about these big sources and then the distance determining from those sources determining the price. So maybe
Right. Okay. Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. I mean, if you could see the, well, I'm not really familiar with, I'm not Indonesian, but what I'm just showing here is that mainly companies are associated in the Sumatra and Java area, right? And what's interesting here is that those that are far-flung area like this one, you see lots of increases in the price relative to 1998. So what my point here is that um, this is one source of variation, and yes, they may be arbitrary. They may be associated with whatever is happening in that local area. It may be associated with the demand of energy in the particular area, right? And so as we go on, you would see that we're going beyond what Corneliu and Corneliu and Martin Corneliu and June Rentschler did, which is, in their study, they relied mostly on this arguably exogenous prices, but we're going beyond that in our empirical strategy. So we're just using it, but not solely relying on these geographical variations. Does that make sense? Hopefully that
yeah,
will make
sure.
sense. And then later on, tell me, based on our empirical strategy, whether we're still missing or not capturing the arguably exogenous sources of this price changes.
Okay, great, thanks.
Okay. Right. So just to briefly discuss the data, what we're using is the detailed plant level data of Indonesian manufacturing industry. It has all manufacturing plants with 20 or more employees. So you can say that this is medium to large enterprises. um, Martin Corneliu and June Lenschler, they did it for the micro industry, so it's a repeated sample. However, we're using a panel data here, so we were able to observe firms starting from 1980 all the way to 2015, giving us more than 500,000 plant year observations, and that provides us some richer analysis. And then it's very detailed. It has both economic variables and energy use. So the good thing about this is that although we don't observe the price per se, the good thing about it is we have the value based on their purchases as well as the volume, and so we could look at the average price that the firm is paying for each energy input. Now, of course, average price, that's a little bit endogenous, and so later on in the empirical strategy, I'm going to tell you how we tackled this endogeneity issue. Okay, just a sample calculation of the energy use and CO2 emission. As we probably know, it's really hard to get pollution and energy usage in the developing country setting, and so we leverage on the detailed information that we get from the data, and so based on that we can calculate the energy inputs based on some conversion factors that we get from EPA and EIA. Now, you would argue that what we're doing here is that we're implicitly assuming that the technology or the abatement costs of firms are the same or a constant over time as well. That might be a heroic assumption for the latter year, but in the previous year, like from 1980 to 1990, that probably is not as heroic. But again, this is an issue that we need to consider. And at the moment, I don't think of anything else or any other measure that we can think of in order to measure environmental performance. But if you have any idea of how to measure this, that would be great. But this is the same measure that we applied in our trade paper that was published in 2019. Okay, sorry for the horrible table. This is just showing summary statistics, not really interesting. But the point here is that we have more than 70,000 unique plant IDs or unique firms. And then we have more than 500,000 observations for pretty much most of the variables. Okay, so this is the empirical strategy that we have used. Ideally, if we believe that the price changes are exogenous, which is probably not, but for a moment, if we believe that that's exogenous, then we can run a simple regression on the log price on whatever that we want to look at, maybe output, energy use, or employment. And so the beta one here would be your measure of elasticity. Now, that's probably not a good way to run a regression because we know that price is an equilibrium condition, and so it's subject to a lot of endogeneity issues. So we could control for a lot of things. So first, we could control for the unobserved heterogeneity that is constant over time, and that's for the plant specific effects or fixed effects. There may be some exogenous or changes in the industry or improvement in the technology that might affect demand for energy and therefore the price, and it could also affect economic output, and therefore we have to take into account those changes. And so that's why we input two-digit sector year specific effects to take into account those factors. We also could take into account different trajectories in terms of development of specific area. And so this goes to the assumption that maybe there are planning changes in the province area that might affect both price as well as economic performance or environmental performance. And that's the reason why we have province-specific trends. Now, based on this, we control for a lot of things, but still there may be some reverse causality here because of the demand. So if output is increasing over time from the firms, that would increase demand, and so that would increase price. And so we have to also tease that or take that into account. So how do we control for that? Okay, before that, this is just showing you that arguing that even if with this specification, the uh, the price is still subject to some endogeneity issues. What you see here is the correlation between the energy price and energy intensity at the industry level. And so what you see here is that the price that the heavy industries like machineries and metal and all that, these are the big firms in Indonesia and probably highly polluting because they are energy intensive. But what you see here is that the price that they effectively face using the average price that we calculated is actually lower than those that are less energy intensive. And so this is showing that perhaps even if we control for a lot of things, the price would still be endogenous. Now, this slide looks at the distribution of province demeaned energy prices using select energy sources. So this is an appeal to the geographic variation that we were talking about a while ago. So this is saying that if it is true that the price changes are exogenous at a particular area, right? And so individual or firm level decisions do not affect the price at a particular area, then you would expect that if you take the average or province demeaned energy prices, you wouldn't expect any variation that is left because everything that will be absorbed to the province demeaning. But what you see here is that even if we demean the energy prices at the province level, there's still some variations going on, right? And so that makes still, even if we use the geographic variation, there's still some endogeneity that is left using our average price metric. And so how do we take this into account? This is just an undergrad way of explaining what we're doing. And so the energy price that is being paid by the firm would have a plant or output or impact on output and productivity. And so that will affect demand, and then that will affect the price as well. And so that's not good. And so what we want to do is to use an instrument, and what we're using is what we call the fixed weight energy price index that Stefania is really familiar about with the paper with Misato published in Energy Economics. And so, yes, this is an instrumental variable that we want to look at, similar to Lin and Marine and Vona 2017 paper. So what is this fixed weight energy price? This is a little bit of a modification of the fixed energy price index that Misato and others have done. And so what we want to do here is that we want to look at the median price in province K at time t for specific energy J, right? And then we want to look at the average, but we're fixing the weights as if this is the WIO is the share of fuel J to total energy use of firm J in the pre-sample year 0. Right. So what we're doing is that you calculate the share of each input, and then you peg that share at T0, and then we eliminate that T0 in the observations. That makes it a pre-sample. And then moving on, we use the median price to calculate the average price that the firm is actually facing at that particular time period. So this is both changing over time and over firm, depending on their initial share of that input in time 0. And we just use the top energy prices. And why? Because some of the firms are not using, for example, LPG, kerosene, and firewood. And you could argue that the top 6, not including the other fuel, because it's hard to know the unit of measurement for that other fuel. But based on this top energy, we see that it's more or less 90% of the total energy usage are attributed to the top energy share. And so that's what we use in calculating the fixed energy price index. Okay, so going on to the result, these are very preliminary. We have trying to update this, but take it as face value. This is the effect of energy price on environmental and economic performance using a 2-stage least square estimator, having PEPI as our instrument. And so to summarize, what we're seeing here is that in terms of the reduction of energy use and CO2 emission, a 10% increase in the price would reduce energy use by about 5 or 6% in terms of CO2 emission. Now, what's interesting here is that there's no strong evidence to suggest that it has an impact on output, and we're going to talk about that shortly. That may be associated with heterogeneity of emission. But in terms of employment, you see that the same change in the price, that 10% increase in the price, would only reduce employment by 2%. And so in terms of the relative impact on the environment as well as the employment, you see that there's pretty much minimal, and this is just marginally significant, and we're gonna look into that in terms of the heterogeneity of effect later on. That this is just associated to only concentrated on the big firms and those that are relying heavily on energy inputs.
Sorry, Arlan. Don't know if you mentioned already. Is the price contemporaneous or is it lagged?
Okay. No, this is contemporaneous. So this is using the median price at time t, the median price at time t for the specific province, but it's changing over firm because firms have different shares of input. But yes, it's using the contemporaneous median price of that province.
Yeah, I was wondering whether it might be worth lagging it at least one period for for the fact to take place.
Right.
Employment.
Yeah, we try that as well, and I mean, pretty much we get almost exactly the same result, and then the idea is, I think it's associated with the study of the locker in such a way that the decision that firms are making are actually way before, anyways, and even before they observe the energy, their decisions are being made way before. But yes, there is a lag, but we look into that in our robustness check, and it's not in here though. But we see exactly the same trend. It's mostly huge for energy use and CO2 emission and less on employment. But I'll take note of that in the next presentation. Thank you. Any other? Okay.
And what is the magnitude of the change in price that we would observe, just to get a sense of how big the actual ultimate effect?
I mean, on the average, before the 2000 change, right? The changes are pretty much small and very insignificant. It's just around 1-2%. But after 2000, we're seeing a change between 50 to 100%, and that makes it really quite significant.
Yeah,
and that's mainly and that's mainly because of the associated removal of fossil fuel reforms.
Yeah, I think that's quite interesting. I think in one paper that we abandoned somehow, we were trying really to see whether there is this threshold that's beyond a certain increase in price, then it is this trigger, much bigger. So there's some sort of non-linearity that, I don't know if it makes sense in your context. At least we were trying to, come up with this threshold for a carbon price that would have, triggered some, much more damaging effect, if any. So I don't know if so, consider non-linear effects.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't looked at that. Yeah, definitely I will include that in the revision. Or maybe some threshold, and yeah, it would be nice to look at nonlinear effect and see when firms are actually starting to act. What kind of price changes are we looking at?
Yes, in particular, if you have this long period with little changes, that might, flatten your overall effect. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you're trying to somewhat describe the demand function for the firms, essentially, right?
Yeah.
Okay. That's interesting. I should take note of that. Okay. Right. In terms of factor intensities, we also looked at energy intensity and CO2 intensity, and it's really huge. And of course, this could be confounded by also increase in output and reduction in energy. But as we can see it at face value, it has the same magnitude as what we see previously. In terms of substitution, energy per worker, or if you will, you can interpret this as labor productivity per energy use as well. So how much energy is using per worker. you can see there's also a reduction in that regard. And so it's really hard to interpret this as maybe it's also due to substitution, or maybe workers are being more productive in terms of energy use. We don't know, and that's something that we need to tease out later on. Okay, so here is looking at the mechanism in a way. So we want to know what's really driving the reduction in energy use associated with the changes in the price. And so what you see here are the changes in purchases and sales for land, buildings, machineries, and vehicles. So we have data on expenditures on fixed assets and also their sales. And so what you see here is that it seems like there's no change in the land, and that's probably expected. But in terms of the durables, like vehicles, we see that the 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 acceleration in terms of the purchases and sales are increasing, and so we can interpret this as such that they are updating their capital or their vehicles because of these price changes, and maybe newer vehicles are associated with probably more energy efficiency, and so they're changing their assets towards more energy efficient capital. In the same way as the same interpretation for machineries. Not sure about buildings because we don't know whether this is a repair or they just really leave the factory one aspect of it and then change it to something else. But we see that there's a trend that firms respond to energy prices by updating their capital into more arguably energy efficient ones. Okay, so these are sort of some of the nonlinearities that we exploit. Sorry about the labels if they're not that clear. But on the top panel, that's just the estimated effect of energy use, energy intensity, and CO2 emissions depending on their initial or pre-sample log output, meaning their output at T0. And at the bottom panel, that's the employment, log capital, and capital labor ratio. Now, the distribution of this is in the appendix, but the mean and the median here is much concentrated between 17, and it goes all the way to 10 and right around 23. But the concentration is somewhere here. Okay, now, what's interesting here is that in terms of energy use, intensity, and CO2 emissions, they are all declining. But those that are higher, meaning bigger in terms of their output, are actually declining much, much more than their smaller one counterparts. And so those firms that are big to begin with, when they are shocked with price, they're the ones that are reducing energy use and energy intensity. And that pretty much is intuitive. And why? Maybe because this is also associated with their energy intensity. So the big ones are the heavy industries like machineries and equipment. And so when the subsidies have been removed, there's an instantaneous increase in the price. They're the ones that are responding more to the shock. Now, in terms of employment, this is quite interesting. For sufficiently small firms, their employment are increasing, but those that are already big, they are declining. And we're going to tease that out when we look at the firm entry and exit. And we're going to show you that perhaps this is related to entry and exit of some of the energy inefficient firms. Okay, so this has the same picture, except that on the x-axis you have the pre-sample log energy intensity, and it has the same trend as before. Those that are heavily reliant on energy, they're the ones that are responding more to the shock. But if you look at the employment, which is interesting, I think, is that there's not much significant effect for those that are not much reliant on energy. But those that are reducing employment are the ones that are heavily reliant on energy. And so, again, you would expect that these are the heavy industries. And so they're the ones that are actually reducing and laying off workers. Interestingly, in terms of capital and capital labor ratio, you have a decline in capital for sufficiently less intensive firms, and also for capital labor ratio. I don't have any explanation in that for at the moment, but if you have an idea why this is the case, then probably that would be helpful. But in terms of the distribution, anyways, most of the firms are situated around 7 here, and so these are probably driven by mostly outliers. Okay, so this is a little bit of extension, and you should take this again with a grain of salt. I just run a simple IV Provit following Martin et al. In 2014. And so what you can see here is that each column is a separate regression with different regressor. The first one is energy price of the combined fuel and electricity. The second one is just using price of fuel, and the third one is using electricity. And so we're controlling for whether all as using an indicator variable that turns to 1 when the pre-output level is less than the median and 0 otherwise. And we also have a measure of pre-sample energy intensity. So they're intensive if their energy intensity is greater than the median and 0 otherwise. And so what's the takeaway here is that changes in electricity doesn't really affect exit, but it's mostly driven by changes in the fuel. But if you look at the magnitude here, there seems to be a reinforcing mechanism through which when both price increase, the probability or the change in the probability associated with firm exit is actually a lot higher when both of them increase. And so uh, we would interpret this as if firms are facing both increase or shocks in electricity and fuel, then they are more likely to exit in the industry. Now, we did a little bit of sample split in order to have a richer analysis and sort of appeal to the nonlinear effect of energy price shock. So in the first 2 columns, we just split the sample based on whether the sample is less than the median in terms of its pre-sample output. So whether it's small, and then the second one is whether they are initially large. And so in terms of their response to the shock, they're pretty much the same. So they're fairly the same. But in terms of their energy intensity, those that are highly energy intensive are responding more relative to those that are less intensive. And so based on these 2 results, it seems to me that those that are smaller based on the initial regression and those that are heavily reliant on energy are the ones that are most likely to exit from the industry when there's an instantaneous change in the price. And that's probably the reason why we expect nonlinear effect in terms of employment here in this slide. And so the idea is those that are less efficient in energy are pretty much smaller. And so in terms of competition, those that are surviving the shock are increasing in terms of the market share because their competitive or their inefficient competitors are actually being weeded out. But those that are surviving the industry, those that are bigger, I mean, they have a different competition to begin with. And so even if those small companies that are being weeded out from the industry, they don't have any effect on the probability of exit of these firms, or also in terms of their competition. And so they're the ones that are responding more in terms of employment. So they're the ones that are shrinking. But those that are surviving but efficient, they're the ones that are potentially increasing in size, because again they have increasing share in the market because all the inefficient small ones are being weeded out. Right, we also did a little bit of a sectoral analysis. So this is also a split sample. So we run our specification in each 2-digit ISIC sector level. And so this is based on energy. This is the dependent variable here is the energy use in terms of million British thermal units. And so what you see here is that those that are heavily reliant, those industries that are heavily reliant on energy, are the ones that are responding more in terms of their energy use. So they're the ones that are decreasing, and then their parameter estimates are actually quite significant. That's in relation to other industries like food and apparel, and surprisingly textile. For a moment, I thought textile is using a lot of energy, but it seems that they're not. And so you don't see any significant effect in terms of their energy use. This is in terms of employment. So we also run or split the sample into 2-digit I6 sector, and we run our specification in each of the groups. And what we see here is that there's not much action going on. So in terms of log employment at the sector level, we don't see any significant reduction in terms of employment. So this is also a little extension. Again, we should take this with a grain of salt. I just followed the methodology by Davis and Haltewanger in 1992, which have their net job creation, net flow metrics. So the pause here is the index in which at the particular industry and province level as well. Sorry, at the province level, because the price changes at the province level, and so we want to also make a sort of mm, job flow metric at the province level. And so what this pause ST here is the job creation index for each time at the particular sector, and this is calculated by using a weighted average of the growth rates of a particular firm at the particular time period. So if the growth is positive, and then we weight it based on the average employment of the firm uh, uh, relative to the that province, and then we sum it up for all industries. And so we have that for the for the job creation. We also have the for the job loss. So if the growth, analogously, if the growth is negative, and so we also have a weighted average at the particular province and industry level. And then again, following Davis and Altewanger, there's also this net job flow, which is just a difference between the gross job creation and then the gross job loss. And then we use that metrics in order to look at, so this is going to be our dependent variable. And then we looked at some changes in the price at the particular province level. So again, there's a lot of endogeneity here, and so you should take it with a grain of salt. But what we're doing is just we're trying to see if there's at the aggregate level, if there's a change in the job flows associated with price changes. And so the main takeaway of this is that we don't see a significant effect, and pretty much the parameter estimate are quite small, which is also surprisingly almost equivalent to what we see in the firm level analysis. And so in terms of summary, and so these are just preliminary summary or conclusion, if you will. We see that the energy use and emissions of surviving plants, both in levels and per unit of output, decline significantly in response to an energy price. But in contrast to other studies or previous studies in the literature, we don't see strong evidence to suggest that this price changes or this stricter energy policy associated with the removal of the subsidies in Indonesia, it doesn't have any strong detrimental effect on employment and output, given entry expansion or exit contraction of plants. And so if you take this as face value and if you believe the estimates, with some caveats on the robustness of it, pending a number of robustness checks, we see that perhaps if we really want to curb out the emissions or greenhouse gas emissions around the world, there may be some areas in which we could prioritize developing country initiatives. But again, this is just very preliminary because as I speak right now, there also this ongoing project wherein we looked at the employment of this in terms of employment class and gender employment. And because of this firm entry and exit, we have preliminary results that this has unintended consequence on female employment. So those exiting as well as those that are contracting are the ones that are heavily employing females. And so we're thinking that that is more like the unintended consequence of this stricter energy policy. And so to make this in a more holistic sense, it would be good to also look at that area in order to eliminate any unintended impact of this stricter energy policy. And that's all I have. So thank you so much for having me here and for listening. And I'm open for questions.
Great, thank you, Arlan. Are there any questions?
I have some questions. Stefania again.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Stefania.
Again, I think, looking at, more long-term effects, it might be even more relevant when you look at exit of firms. So I don't know if there you might actually want to have a specification where you try to look at this. And also, I think this is more like a suggestion. So you have plant level data, and perhaps you might also have multiple plants within a firm located in multiple locations. So I don't know if you can actually exploit that. So in that paper I mentioned, which we somehow stopped working on, but we were basically seeing effects. We were looking across countries. Effects are stronger for multinationals as they can more easily increase output, in one of their different locations, depending on, so taking advantage of this. So I was wondering, since you do have this geographical variation in price changes, whether you might see a stronger effect for plants that are actually part of a group, and where the group can decide to change, decrease output wherever it is more convenient, where decrease energy use, yes, whatever is there.
Oh yeah, thanks for that, Stefania. This is really useful. On the exit, yes, that's that IV probit thing. I mean, that's very preliminary, and there's a lot of ways to tease that out. And what I did is just a simple sort of a diagnostic of whether I would be able to see an effect. But there may be some more robust method of doing this, and so I might need to work on that a little bit more, and maybe there are more robust way of teasing out this entry and exit actually dynamics. But yes, thank you for that. On the firm with multiple location, the problem with the data set in Indonesia is that yes, they are at the installation or plant level, but you don't observe their parent company. And so you don't know if they belong to a conglomerate or a big company. You just observe where they are. Now, maybe one way to tease that out is that we could also observe whether they're foreign owned or not. And that one we know from the data. And so the way to do this is perhaps we could approximate the effect by looking at differential effect whether they're foreign owned, or maybe because if they're foreign owned, they may be part of a bigger global value chain. So that might be a way to tease that out, although I'm not sure if that would capture everything that you've said in this.
Yeah, also maybe, or the Orbis data, and that's, might give you, but that would be a completely different data set, and it would be probably a different paper, but that you might have this relationship between firms, knowing the parent and, but yeah, probably another paper. But, since you have this interesting variation in prices, there might be spin-off.
Yes. I'm trying to get in touch with Leo Jacobo of the World Bank in DC, and he has a nice data in Mexico. That one is a little bit more complete, and you could go up to the product level data. But up to now, I'm still unsuccessful in getting in getting some in getting my hands on that data. So for those who want to work with the Mexican data, yes, that's if you think that this Indonesian data is good, then that one is a lot better.
Go ahead, Stephen.
Great. I'll keep on with my my principle of putting my camera on. So hi.
Hi.
I was simply wondering, sort of, you point to the fact that identification is kind of strenuous in this setting. Have you considered exploiting? I mean, the first obvious kind of differential shock that happened in differential in the sense that it hit in different ways in Indonesia to me is, of course, the 2004 tsunami, which, from what I see, is part of your data set, right? And there are a couple of papers out there that are kind of looking at some of these effects, and seemingly there are quite some important effects. Have you, I mean, first of all, have you thought about that problem? But maybe also a way to talk about, the economic changes would perhaps be to exploit some of the regions that were hit harder rather than others, right? And so you could think some Darwinian argument of regions that were hit hard, right? The kind of bottom level of the competition was wiped out and couldn't rebuild, and therefore the structure of the kind of local economies changed. And then looking at sort of some consequences of that, either in terms of environmental policy or something like that. Have you thought about sort of something along those lines?
Oh yes, thanks for asking. I'm actually presenting that paper in 2 weeks. So we have a data using MDAT data, and the problem with the MDAT data is at the country level, right? And so what we did is we localize it, and so we have data at the kabupaten level, at the regency level, since the 1900s, but we only look at the 1990s because it's a little bit sketchy that the events are increasing over time, which is not really. It's a function of reporting, but the anything after 1990 that makes it reliable. And so what we see here is um, in relation to this paper, we want to tease out how disasters are influencing environmental and economic performance of firms. And so in terms of mechanism, is it logistical, or is it demand shock, or is it supply shock, or maybe it's an infrastructure, in which case, because this is Indonesia, right, and they're pretty much spread all over the, not all over the place, but all over the country because they're islands. And so when a disaster hit a local area, their infrastructure are just wiped out. And so if that effect is associated with increase in price in energy, because again, the roads are wiped out, so the supplies are constrained, that would shoot up the price, specifically for far-flung areas where you have private players in there and regulation is not working that much. And so yes, that's part of that other project, and we see that it has a serious effect on both environmental and economic performance, as well as in the equity side of it. We see that female employments are actually the ones that are being hammered in this. So yes, there's an interaction between this energy policy as well as the disaster events. But we also look at flooding only. I haven't looked at the bigger ones like volcano and stuff like that. But we have data on that as well.
Great, thanks.
So maybe if Stephen would invite me again to present that paper, then I would and present that here.
Be happy to. I'm just afraid that I'll jinx it and sort of set off another global pandemic. But no, of course things don't work like that. We've got one more hand up. Harriet Rogers, you can go ahead.
Hi. So I was just wondering, have you looked into the reason why female employment is hit harder than male?
Oh, okay. So those that are in the heavy industries are dominated by males, right? So in that one,
Why is that?
those that are in the heavy industries like machineries and
Yeah,
whatnot, they're dominated by males. And we see from our estimate that for in terms of surviving firms, right, the reduction in employment is not that much. It's very minimal. And so if there's a reduction in employment, there could be concentrated in those heavy industries, right? And so those are going to be affecting males. But in terms of employment associated with the exit, that's a lot bigger. And so in terms of absolute numbers, those that are being weeded out, those that are inefficient and smaller firms, they're predominantly employing females. And so the mechanism is a little bit different. So for surviving firms, yes, it's biased against male employment, but for exiting firms, which in terms of employment shock is a lot higher, then that one is biased against females.
Okay, thank you.
So this is similar to what we're seeing in the pandemic, I think. So I have another paper with the World Bank looking at the employment effects associated with the pandemic and seeing that, yeah, female employment are also being hammered because they're employed at employed by micro enterprises, smaller ones, and less resilient firms.
Yeah, I suppose also it's face-to-face services is the thing that's really sort of hammered by the COVID-19 lockdown sort of policies.
Yeah. Also that one, tourism and hospitality. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, Arlan, for a really nice talk, and thanks everyone for showing up. We will be back next week, so watch out for an announcement. But yeah, thanks everyone, and have a good rest of your week.
Yeah, thank you so much for the comments and the suggestions. They're pretty really useful and helpful. I hope we could keep in touch. Maybe there's areas for collaboration later on.
Thanks a lot, Arlan.
Okay.
Bye, Arlan.
Have a
Bye,
great
everyone.
one. Bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Estefania.
Thank you.